In the late 1990s, on a quiet suburban street in northern New Jersey, a black sedan idled outside a modest two-story home. The neighborhood was unremarkable: tree-lined sidewalks, trimmed lawns, the faint glow of porch lights flickering on as evening settled in. To anyone passing by, it looked like the setting of an ordinary American life. But behind those doors, another world existed. A world of whispered conversations, coded language, and decisions that could determine whether a man lived or disappeared without a trace. When The Sopranos premiered in 1999, it offered audiences an intimate glimpse into this hidden universe. It humanized mob bosses, showing them not only as criminals, but as fathers, husbands, and men struggling with anxiety and identity. It blurred the line between brutality and domestic normalcy. But the truth was far less sympathetic. The real American Mafia, the one that existed long before television cameras arrived, was colder, more calculating, and infinitely more ruthless than anything portrayed on screen. And to understand that truth, we have to go back. Not to a suburban home in New Jersey, but to the crowded streets of early 20th century America. In the summer of 1910, waves of immigrants poured into New York City. Among them were thousands of Italians, many fleeing poverty, political instability, and violence in southern Italy and Sicily. They settled in tight-knit communities, Little Italy in Manhattan, neighborhoods in Brooklyn and the Bronx, bringing with them their language, traditions, and, in some cases, something far darker. The concept of organized crime did not begin in America. It was imported. In Sicily, secret societies had long operated in the shadows, enforcing their own systems of power where the government was weak or absent. These groups relied on loyalty, silence, and fear, principles that would later define the American Mafia. In the crowded tenements of New York, those traditions took root. At first, the operations were small: protection rackets, gambling dens, loan sharking schemes. Immigrant communities, often distrustful of police and government institutions, became fertile ground for exploitation. And in that environment, certain individuals began to rise. They were not yet legends, not yet feared across cities or states, but they understood something others did not. Power could be built quietly, and once established, it could be nearly impossible to dismantle. By the 1920s, America had entered a new era, one defined by prohibition. In 1920, the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol across the United States. What was intended as a moral reform quickly became one of the greatest opportunities for organized crime in American history. Demand for alcohol didn't disappear. It exploded, and the men who could supply it, illegally, discreetly, and at scale, became immensely powerful. In New York, Chicago, and beyond, criminal networks expanded rapidly. Bootlegging operations stretched across state lines. Speakeasies appeared in basements, backrooms, and hidden corridors. Corrupt officials were bribed. Police were paid to look the other way. This was no longer small-time crime. This was an industry. And at its center were men who would shape the Mafia for generations to come. In the chaos of prohibition, violence became a language of its own. Territories were contested. Alliances were fragile, and betrayal was often fatal. Young men entering this world quickly learned its rules. Loyalty was absolute, weakness was punished, and silence, omerta, was sacred. But the violence was not random. It was strategic. Every assassination, every intimidation, every act of brutality served a purpose: to maintain control. And within this system, a new kind of leader began to emerge. Not just a street-level enforcer, but an organizer, a strategist, a man who could see beyond immediate profits and build something lasting. These men understood that chaos was bad for business. What they needed was structure. By the early 1930s, that structure began to take shape. Following a series of brutal internal conflicts, what would later be known as the Castellamarese War, power in the Mafia shifted. Old-world traditions gave way to a more modern, corporate-style approach. The idea was simple. Instead of constant infighting, families would coexist. Territories would be defined. Disputes would be mediated. And above all, profits would be maximized. The Mafia was no longer just a loose collection of gangs. It had become an organization. In New York, 5 major families emerged as dominant forces. Each controlled its own territory, its own operations, and its own network of soldiers and associates. Together, they formed a powerful alliance that would come to be known simply as the Commission. It functioned like a board of directors. Decisions were made collectively. Conflicts were resolved internally. And any action that could draw unnecessary attention from law enforcement or the public was carefully considered. This was the turning point. The Mafia was no longer reactive. It was deliberate, calculated, and deeply embedded within the fabric of American society. By the 1940s and 1950s, the influence of organized crime extended far beyond street-level operations. Unions were infiltrated. Construction projects were controlled. Businesses were coerced into compliance. Politicians were quietly influenced behind closed doors. To the outside world, it was invisible, but within certain industries, it was understood. Nothing moved without approval, and those who resisted often faced consequences that were swift and unforgiving. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the Mafia was not its violence. It was its ability to appear legitimate. Front businesses masked illegal operations. Respectable neighborhoods hid criminal enterprises. And the men at the top often presented themselves not as criminals, but as businessmen, community figures, even role models. This duality would later become a central theme in The Sopranos. But in reality, there was no moral ambiguity. Behind the carefully constructed image was a system built on exploitation, fear, and control. And yet, for decades, law enforcement struggled to fully grasp the scale of what they were facing. The Mafia operated in silence. Witnesses refused to speak. Victims disappeared. Evidence was scarce. It wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a closed society, and breaking into it would require something unprecedented. By the late 1950s, the illusion of invisibility began to crack. In 1957, a meeting of high-ranking Mafia members took place in a quiet town in upstate New York. It was meant to be discreet, a gathering to discuss business, resolve disputes, and reinforce alliances. But it didn't go unnoticed. Law enforcement raided the meeting, capturing dozens of prominent figures. For the first time, the public saw clear evidence of a nationwide criminal network. The Mafia was no longer a rumor. It was real, and it was organized. But exposure did not lead to immediate collapse. If anything, it forced the organization to evolve. Meetings became more secretive, communication became more coded, and the emphasis on loyalty intensified. Those who spoke out faced consequences, not just for themselves, but for their families. The message was clear. Silence was survival. As the decades progressed, the Mafia adapted to changing times. New opportunities emerged. New industries were infiltrated, and new leaders rose through the ranks. Men who were often more educated, more strategic, and more cautious than their predecessors. They understood the importance of staying out of the spotlight, because attention was dangerous, and the greatest threat to their empire was not rival gangs or internal conflict. It was law enforcement. But the story didn't end there, because as the Mafia grew more powerful, so did the efforts to dismantle it. And in the years to come, a series of investigations, betrayals, and unexpected alliances would begin to unravel a system that had seemed untouchable. The suburban image, the illusion of control, the myth of honor, all of it would be tested. And what would be revealed was far more ruthless than any television drama had ever dared to show. By the early 1960s, the American Mafia had reached a level of power that few outside its inner circles could fully comprehend. It was no longer confined to dark alleys or hidden backrooms. It had expanded into the bloodstream of the American economy: construction, trucking, waste management, garment industries, and labor unions. Entire sectors moved under its quiet supervision. And at the center of it all was a system that thrived not on chaos, but on control. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, Mafia families operated with near military precision. Orders flowed downward. Profits flowed upward. And between those two currents existed a rigid hierarchy that left little room for error. Because in this world, mistakes were not corrected. They were erased. On a cold morning in 1963, inside a federal hearing room in Washington, D.C., a man sat before a microphone and did something that had never been done before. He spoke. His name was Joseph Valachi. A low-ranking member of the Mafia, Valachi had spent years operating within its ranks. He understood its structure, its rules, and its unspoken codes. But after a series of internal conflicts and fearing for his life, he made a decision that would send shockwaves through the entire organization. He broke omerta. In calm, measured testimony, Valachi described the inner workings of what he called La Cosa Nostra. He spoke of initiation rituals, of a chain of command, of the existence of the 5 families in New York. For the first time, the American public was given a detailed look inside the Mafia's hidden world. But more importantly, so was law enforcement. That moment changed everything. Until then, the Mafia had relied on secrecy as its greatest weapon. Now that secrecy had been compromised, federal agencies began to shift their strategies. Surveillance intensified. Informants became more valuable than ever. Prosecutors started building cases not just on individual crimes, but on the organization itself. But dismantling the Mafia was not simple, because the Mafia was not just a group of individuals. It was a system. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, that system continued to expand, quietly, efficiently, and ruthlessly. In New York, the 5 families divided control of industries with precision. Construction contracts were manipulated through bid-rigging schemes. Union leaders were either controlled or replaced. Businesses that resisted were pressured, sometimes financially, sometimes violently. In Chicago, similar patterns emerged under the outfit. Las Vegas became a new frontier where Mafia-controlled skim operations quietly siphoned millions of dollars from casino profits. Money flowed in staggering amounts. But it was never just about money. It was about influence. One of the most powerful tools in the Mafia's arsenal was its relationship with labor unions. By controlling unions, the Mafia controlled workers. And by controlling workers, it controlled industries. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters became one of the most significant targets. With hundreds of thousands of members and access to massive pension funds, it represented both power and opportunity. Through intimidation, corruption, and strategic alliances, Mafia figures gained influence within the union's leadership. Loans from union-controlled funds were directed toward projects that benefited organized crime. Casinos, real estate developments, construction ventures. It was a cycle of control that reinforced itself, and it operated largely in the shadows. But shadows can only conceal so much. As the Mafia expanded its reach, internal tensions began to surface. Power struggles, disputes over territory, conflicts over leadership. The very structure that had been designed to prevent chaos was now being tested by ambition. And in this world, ambition was often deadly. In 1979, one of the most powerful figures in New York's underworld was assassinated in broad daylight. His name was Carmine Galante. He had risen through the ranks of the Bonanno crime family with a reputation for brutality and defiance. Unlike other bosses who prefer discretion, Galante was openly aggressive. He expanded heroin trafficking operations and challenged the authority of the commission itself. That made him dangerous, not just to rivals, but to the balance of power. On a summer afternoon in Brooklyn, as he sat in the backyard of a restaurant, gunmen approached and opened fire. The message was unmistakable. No one was untouchable. That same principle governed every aspect of Mafia life. Loyalty was expected, but it was also constantly questioned, because betrayal did not always come from enemies. Sometimes it came from within. By the 1980s, law enforcement had begun to develop more sophisticated tools to combat organized crime. Wiretaps, undercover operations, financial tracking, and most importantly, a legal strategy that would become one of the most effective weapons against the Mafia. The RICO Act, Passed in 1970, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act allowed prosecutors to charge individuals not just for specific crimes, but for their participation in an ongoing criminal enterprise. It was a fundamental shift. Instead of targeting isolated actions, authorities could now target the entire structure. And that structure was about to be tested like never before. In New York, federal prosecutors began building a case that would later become one of the most significant in organized crime history. It was known as the Mafia Commission Trial. The goal was simple: to prove that the leadership of the five families operated as a coordinated criminal organization. But achieving that goal required evidence, and evidence required cooperation. For decades, the Mafia had relied on silence. Now that silence was beginning to break, some members, facing long prison sentences or fearing for their lives, chose to cooperate with authorities. They became informants, witnesses, sources of information that had once been unthinkable to reveal. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle. Each recording captured another fragment of truth. And slowly, the image of an untouchable empire began to crack. But the Mafia was not passive. It adapted, it retaliated, and it continued to operate. Because even under pressure, its core principles remained intact: control, secrecy, and power. During this period, figures like Paul Castellano represented a new kind of leadership. Castellano was not known for street-level violence. He preferred business, strategy, profit. Under his leadership, the Gambino family focused heavily on white-collar crime, construction, fraud, and corporate infiltration. To the outside world, he appeared more like a businessman than a crime boss. But appearances were deceiving, because behind that image was the same system of control, the same willingness to eliminate threats, the same adherence to a code that left no room for weakness. And yet, even within this calculated structure, instability remained. Because power attracts challengers, and challengers create conflict. In December of 1985, that conflict reached a turning point. Outside a steakhouse in Manhattan, Paul Castellano was gunned down. The assassination was not approved by the commission. It was bold, risky, and it signaled a shift in the balance of power. Behind it was a rising figure, someone who would soon become one of the most recognizable faces of the American Mafia. His name was John Gotti. Unlike his predecessors, Gotti did not shy away from attention. He embraced it. Expensive suits, public appearances, a reputation that blurred the line between criminal and celebrity. The media gave him a nickname, the Dapper Don, but that visibility came at cost. Because attention, no matter how controlled, invited scrutiny. And scrutiny led to pressure. Throughout the late 1980s, law enforcement focused heavily on Gotti and the Gambino family. Surveillance intensified, informants were cultivated, and the federal government made it clear that dismantling organized crime was a priority. Trials followed. Charges were brought. But again and again, Gotti avoided conviction. Witnesses refused to testify. Juries returned acquittals. To some, it seemed like the system itself was failing. But the story didn't end there. Because beneath the surface, something was changing. The Mafia's greatest strength, its code of silence, was beginning to weaken. More insiders were talking. More secrets were being revealed. And the walls that had protected the organization for decades were starting to collapse. By the early 1990s, the stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine the future of organized crime in America. The old rules were no longer holding. The balance of power was shifting, and the men who had once operated in the shadows were now being pulled into the light. One by one, case by case, until the empire itself began to fracture. And at the center of that fracture was a truth that no television series could fully capture. The Mafia was not a family. It was a machine, and that machine was starting to break. In the winter of 1992, inside a federal courtroom in Brooklyn, a man who had once seemed untouchable sat quietly as the verdict was read. For years, he had walked through New York City with confidence, tailored suits, a composed smile, and the belief that the system could never truly reach him. But that illusion was over. John Gotti, the so-called Dapper Don, was found guilty on multiple counts of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. The sentence was swift and absolute. Life imprisonment, no parole. It marked one of the most significant victories in the history of the American government's fight against organized crime. But more than that, it marked a turning point, because the conviction of Gotti was not just about one man. It was about the collapse of a system that had relied on silence for generations. The case against Gotti had been built on something the Mafia had long feared. Not surveillance, not wiretaps, but betrayal. At the center of the prosecution's case was Sammy Gravano, Gotti's own underboss, a man who had once stood beside him, enforced his orders, and operated at the highest levels of the Gambino crime family. Gravano made a decision that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. He cooperated. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided detailed testimony about the inner workings of the organization. He described murders, meetings, orders that had once been spoken only in whispers. For prosecutors, it was a breakthrough. For the Mafia, it was a fracture that could not be repaired. Inside the culture of organized crime, loyalty had always been presented as absolute. But in reality, it was conditional. When faced with the certainty of life behind bars, or worse, many began to reconsider their silence. And once that silence was broken, it spread. Throughout the 1990s, more members turned informant. More cases were built. More convictions followed. The code of omerta, the foundation of Mafia power, was eroding. But the unraveling of the Mafia did not happen overnight. It was a slow, methodical process. Case by case, family by family, federal prosecutors continued to use the RICO Act as their primary weapon. The strategy was simple but devastating. Target leadership, disrupt operations, force cooperation, and rebuild cases from the inside out. This approach transformed the legal battlefield. Where once it had been difficult to tie individual crimes to high-ranking figures, prosecutors could now present entire patterns of criminal behavior, supported by testimony, recordings, and financial evidence. The Mafia's structure, once its greatest strength, became its greatest vulnerability. At the same time, societal changes began to reshape the environment in which organized crime had thrived. Industries that had once been dominated by Mafia influence, construction, unions, waste management, came under increased regulation and oversight. Corruption became harder to conceal. Financial transactions became easier to track, and law enforcement agencies became more coordinated in their efforts. The world was changing, and the Mafia was struggling to keep up. Inside its ranks, the impact was clear. Leadership became unstable. Trust eroded, and the sense of invincibility that had once defined the organization began to disappear. Younger members were less committed to the old codes. Older members were either imprisoned or under constant surveillance. The structure remained, but it was weakened. By the early 2000s, the American Mafia still existed, but it was no longer what it had once been. The days of unchecked power, of open influence over entire industries, of near total immunity from prosecution, those days were gone. What remained was a shadow of its former self. Smaller, more cautious, and far less visible. Yet even in decline, the legacy of the Mafia continued to shape public perception. Films, books, and television series kept the image alive. Stories of loyalty, honor, and brotherhood. Narratives that blurred the line between criminality and identity. Among them, The Sopranos stood apart. It presented a deeply human portrait of a mob boss, his struggles, his vulnerabilities, his attempts to balance two worlds. It invited audiences to understand him, even sympathize with him. But the reality was far less nuanced, because behind every moment of introspection, every family dinner, every quiet conversation, there existed a system built on coercion and violence. Real Mafia figures did not sit in therapy sessions discussing their emotions. They enforced control, they eliminated threats, and they operated within a framework where morality was secondary to power. The contrast between fiction and reality is not accidental. Stories are designed to be consumed. Reality is not. In truth, the American Mafia was never about honor. It was about survival. And survival, in that world, often required decisions that were calculated, cold, and irreversible. Men were not judged by their intentions, but by their usefulness. And when that usefulness ended, so did their protection. Even at its peak, the Mafia was not a family in the traditional sense. It was a hierarchy, a system of roles and responsibilities enforced through fear. And like any system built on fear, it was inherently unstable. Because fear does not create loyalty. It creates compliance. And compliance can be broken. Looking back, the rise and fall of the American Mafia tells a broader story. Not just about crime, but about power. How it is built, how it is maintained, and how it ultimately collapses. The suburban homes, the front businesses, the carefully constructed images, all of it served a purpose. To conceal, to normalize, to create the illusion that what existed beneath the surface was something less dangerous than it truly was. But that illusion could never last forever, because systems built on secrecy eventually face exposure, and systems built on violence eventually face resistance. Today, remnants of the Mafia still operate, in quieter ways, in smaller networks, often overshadowed by new forms of organized crime that operate on a global scale. Cybercrime, international trafficking, financial fraud that moves through digital systems rather than physical ones. The landscape has changed, but the principles remain. Control, profit, power. And perhaps that is the most important truth. The Mafia was never just a group of individuals. It was a model, one that has been adapted, replicated, and transformed across different contexts and eras. In the end, the story of the American Mafia is not just about its rise or its fall. It is about the reality behind the myth, a reality far removed from the cinematic portrayals, far removed from the idea of loyalty and honor, and far closer to something much more unsettling. Because the real Mafia did not need dramatic music or scripted dialogue. It operated in silence, in ordinary places, behind closed doors. And for decades, that silence was its greatest weapon. Until, slowly, inevitably, that silence began to break. And when it did, it revealed something far more ruthless than fiction had ever dared to show.